Hello, 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 hello. How we doing here? How we doing here? If you are here, can you please say hello? Hopefully all is going well with everybody. And, you know, just trying to make sure that people are, everybody's everybody is doing good. And, yeah, welcome to I'm Paul Greene-Dennis, and welcome to my real history read-alongs here, and especially for my continuation of what I've been doing for my real history read-alongs here of One Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1, Chapter 5, and I'll put it up in for a second here what I'm reading. Chapter 5, Shades of Grey, Part 1. I skimmed through this chapter. It is a 75-page chapter. Like, it's a very, very, very hefty chapter. And, yeah. And it's so apt. The name of this chapter here, not just simply for this chapter, but in general about the interweaving of the world of organized crime and blackmail, organized crime, legitimate business and illegitimate business, government, CIA, mob, drug trade, everything. And how the world has been so blurred that it's literally just one dense web, convoluted web, that you can't untangle it from each other because it's practically all entangled together. In other words, I can think of it as organized crime and the CIA and the government. It's all one big entanglement that's just been allowed to keep on going and going and going, as we see unfolding right now. That's been unfolding forever. So yeah, this is Chapter 5, Shades of Grey, Part 1 of One Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1. And with that, let's get started with this right here. All right. Let's get started on this beautiful Saturday. And I decided to do it at 1 o'clock, Saturday matinee. But let's get started. Chapter 5, Shades of Grey. Pretty sure there might be a bajillion shades of gray, not just 50. The first part of this chapter, the PR man. Today, the Koreagate scandal of the 1970s is largely forgotten despite the lurid headlines it inspired at the time. Shadowy intelligence operatives, slush funds, kickbacks, complicated schemes to buy political loyalty, and rumors of sex and blackmail were just some of the themes that swirled around Koreagate, and the man at its center, Tongsun Park. Hmm, sounds familiar. As noted in the previous chapter, Park had studied at Georgetown University, where he developed close ties to certain groups of young conservative activists. While there, he was also recruited by the KCIA. Hold on, let me dim this down a bit. Right there. I'll repeat that part there. While there, he was recruited by the CIA, the Korean intelligence apparatus. After graduating, Park became a well-to-do businessman in the D.C. area, as well as a social gadfly, forming connections with congressmen, senators, and staffers on both sides of the political aisle. Hmm. Let me get this right there, bang. Making a warmer color. What became known as Koreagate was said to have begun when Chung Il-kwon, South Korea's prime minister, tasked the head of the KCIA, Kim Hong-yuk, with devising an operation to influence political opinion in the United States. The resulting scheme entailed the services of Park, who was then brokering rice sales contracts from the U.S. to South Korea under the auspices of the government's Food for Peace program. While working with Congressman Richard T. Hanna, who represented California, one of America's largest rice-producing states, Park utilized the commissions on these sales to peddle influence. You don't say. He called upon his impressive network of contacts who were interwoven throughout the offices of powerful Washington businesses and institutions, as well as private clubs and backrooms of the Capitol, to carry out his series of kickbacks and bribes. Wow. Appearing on the periphery of Koreagate, at least as far as the official investigation was concerned, was one of Park's close associates, the powerful lobbyist and public relations executive, Robert Keith Gray. Across the course of his lengthy and impressive career, Gray was adept at the art of influence peddling. The breadth of his associates ran from Korean CIA operatives such as Park to U.S. CIA agents such as Edwin P. Wilson and soon-to-be CIA Director William Casey. That name is coming up everywhere. Among his other close associates and/or clients were Adnan Khashoggi, Robert Maxwell, here we go again with that name, the Teamsters, and BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, among many others. It all added up to Gray acting as a key node in a shadowy network that was becoming increasingly aligned and integrated with the halls of power. Gray's name would often bubble up alongside numerous scandals, with Koreagate being just one. Others would include Watergate, the largely forgotten Pageboy scandal of 1982, and the Iran-Contra affair. Gray hailed from Hastings, a moderately sized industrial town nestled in the Nebraskan countryside, about 2.5 hours west of Omaha. Early on, he showed an interest in politics and was an avid participant in his high school debate club. After his graduation in 1939, he and several members of his debate club attended Carleton College in Minnesota. His chosen area of study was political science. A year later, with World War II looming on the horizon, the U.S. Navy launched its V-7 program, which was a rapid training course for naval officers. V-7 worked closely with universities across the United States, and Gray quickly enlisted. The next couple of years were a whirlwind for Gray. He attended the Navy Supply Corps Midshipman Officer School in Newport, Rhode Island, and found time to take business management courses at Harvard. This threefold educational path, politics, business, and adjacency to the military, became defining characteristics of the rest of his long and storied career. Yet, it would be some time before he was able to make a name for himself. After the war, he bounced back to Hastings, where he worked at the naval depot that had been built there. He spent his free time building social capital. He taught business courses at Hastings College and joined many of the city's organizations and social clubs, including the local Masonic Lodge. During this second period in Hastings, Gray became acquainted with Fred Seaton, owner of the Hastings Tribune and a powerful figure in Nebraskan politics. Gray then served as a state senator before serving as President Eisenhower's Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs. He brought a few things with him to the Capitol, among them Seaton's contact information. Seaton managed to find Gray a position in the vast complexes of the post-war bureaucracy. He went to work in the Pentagon, serving as a special assistant to Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Albert Pratt. Gray received a promotion in May 1956, which propelled him higher in the strata of power within the Eisenhower administration. He became a special assistant to the White House, acting as deputy to Seaton. Yet, as Susan Trento points out in The Powerhouse, there may have been more to this position than meets the eye. He had been designated as an accepted appointment, which means that in lieu of a standard promotion, he had been simply detailed to the White House from the Navy. If Gray was still technically working for the Navy while at the White House, it is likely that his new position involved intelligence and security concerns. His primary task was to sift through realms of data in connection with Washington job seekers. Gray, as Trento writes, was controlling the flow of information about everyone looking for patronage or political jobs at a federal level. A significant amount of this information was marked highly confidential, which gave Gray an inside track on government power. Soon, he was working under Sherman Adams, Eisenhower's chief of staff. Adams was an early Rockefeller Republican and a master bureaucrat. You don't say. You don't say. He was known for regulated access to the president. Nobody, it was said, could speak to Eisenhower without Adams' approval. He made up an inner circle of Eisenhower cronies that included Floyd Odlum and George Allen, powerful, politically connected businessmen whose interests existed in immediate proximity to the emergent military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower would later call it, as well as the increasingly brazen intersection of intelligence and business interests. This was the world that Gray was easing his way into under the tutelage of Adams. After the untimely departure of Adams under the cloud of scandal, Gray gained a new mentor, Richard Nixon. This was Gray's introduction into an expanded network of contacts that shaped the trajectory of the rest of his life. In 1960, he went to work for the ill-fated Nixon presidential campaign, perhaps encountering for the first time his future friend, William Casey. He also became associated with Clark Clifford in this period. Clifford, a Democratic Party insider and archetypal Cold Warrior, was one of DC's elite attorneys and had an extensive Rolodex. Hmm. Decades later, Clifford was among the numerous U.S. political and business figures implicated in the BCCI scandal, the subject of Chapter 7. Beginning in early 1980s, Clifford served as chairman of the board of First American Bank Shares, a major DC based bank that had fallen under the secret control of BCCI via their takeover of the bank's parent company. As Edward J. Epstein has pointed out, First American was a bank used by numerous congressmen and other political figures. Control of the bank created possible blackmail opportunities. Shortly after Clifford took control of First American, Gray joined the bank's board of directors. Hi, Cherie. Following John F. Kennedy's defeat of Nixon in 1960, Gray left government service for a position at Hill and Knowlton, H&K, a major public relations and lobbying firm that had been launched in the 1920s by John Hill and Donald Knowlton. While H&K would become synonymous with the inner conflicts and flashy affairs of the D.C. Beltway, with clients including everyone from presidential hopefuls to BCCI. In the early days, it was a Cleveland-based company with a particular focus on the local steel industry and the banks that financed it. In the aftermath of World War II, H&K became a major promoter of the aviation industries that were then benefiting from the fusion of American heavy industry and the U.S. military. John Hill, for example, was a member of the Air Power League, a pressure group formed by a large coterie of businessmen and military officers with the goal of educating the public about aviation and raising support for the construction of greater airport facilities and air training programs. The league was closely aligned with the Aviation Industries Association, AIA, the major aviation trade association that H&K had taken on as a client. Such connections firmly ensconced H&K within the military-industrial complex, as the Encyclopedia of Public Relations makes clear. The Aviation Industries Association sought a steady diet of military appropriations for its member companies, and it promoted air safety, travel, and other aspects of civil aviation. After the war ended, military contacts took a nosedive, so the agency focused on convincing the federal government to audit the nation's air policies and its readiness for another war. When both Congress and President Harry S. Truman set up commissions to review air policy, Hill and Knowlton helped industry officials prepare their testimony and publicize the board's findings. Joining with the American Legion, the AIA sponsored a campaign. Air power is peace power, beginning in 1947. Right. Air power is peace power. H&K was also linked, it seems, to the CIA. Robert Crowley, a longtime operator within the agency's Directorate of Operations, stated that the firm's overseas offices were perfect cover for the ever-expanded CIA. Crowley would have been in position to know. He acted as the CIA's liaison to the business world, which entailed the use of existing businesses as covers for agents abroad and the creation of proprietary firms to act as fronts. Crowley may have even helped bring a young George H.W. Bush into the CIA's fold, as Bush's Zapata Petroleum served as an agency front for various Caribbean operations during Crowley's time as an agency liaison. Gray himself was likely tied directly to these efforts. When Edwin Wilson checked with the CIA's Office of Security prior to adding Gray to the board of a CIA front called Consultants International, he discovered that Gray had already been cleared by the spy agency, that Gray had previous clearances. And now the next part of this chapter, inside the Georgetown Club. During the 1960s, Gray became aligned with a powerful bloc of interests known as the China Lobby, an early Cold War equivalent of today's Israel Lobby. The China Lobby represented the nationalist Chinese, the Kuomintang, KMT, and their supporters in Washington. The China Lobby called for U.S. support for Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan against the Chinese communists led by Mao Zedong. In its most extreme form, this support entailed militarized intervention in mainland China and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. As scholars such as Peter Dale Scott have shown, many of these activities set in motion a complex chain of events that later cascaded into the Vietnam War. Wow. One of the strongest actors in the China Lobby was Anna Chennault, who cultivated contacts with countless politicians, businessmen, military figures, and intelligence officers. She held positions on the boards of numerous companies and acted as an advisor to various U.S. presidents. She also served as a diplomatic channel to the leaders not only in Taiwan, but in South Korea, the Philippines, Japan, and elsewhere. Gray was particularly close to Chennault, though the exact details of how the two first met are unknown. Anna Chennault's husband had been Claire Chennault, the leader of the first American volunteer group, better known as the Flying Tigers during World War II. With ranks drawn from the U.S. military, the Flying Tigers trained at bases maintained in Burma before flying to China to fight Japanese forces alongside the KMT. From the late 1930s, Claire Chennault had served as a military advisor to Chiang Kai-shek and his brother-in-law, the powerful TV Sung. As previously detailed in Chapter 1, Claire Chennault was a very well-connected man, and this included ties to the Roosevelt administration. After the war, the Chennaults became the core members of the China lobby, and in those early years managed an impressive airlift of American relief supplies in China. Central to this effort had been the creation of a new airline called Civil Air Transport, CAT. As previously noted, CAT would later morph into the CIA airline Air America, which would subsequently become the infamous Southern Air Transport. What? There were also other airline companies in this mix. As was also noted in Chapter 1, an air freighter called Flying Tiger Lines was set up by a coterie of Claire Chennault's former pilots, and Anna Chennault joined the company as its vice president of international affairs. Evidence suggests that Flying Tiger Lines was also utilized by the CIA, and its board of directors included individuals linked to organized crime. Wow, you don't say. At the same time, Anna acted as a consultant to numerous large aviation concerns, including Pan American, whose interests directly intermingled with those of the CIA's CAT Air American complex. At any rate, Flying Tiger Lines remained squarely in the fold of the China lobby and its numerous allies. Over the years, writes Susan Trento, Flying Tiger would evolve into World Airways, and Gray would become a board member. Gray's early political mentor, the future president Richard Nixon, was also an ally of the China lobby. Many journalists and academics have identified Nixon as being a member of the lobby, but a 1992 academic paper suggests that his involvement with them was more pragmatic than ideological. He fostered good relations with Chiang Kai-shek and TV Soong, which spilled over into business arrangements during the 1960s. When Nixon temporarily left politics for private law. One of his biggest clients was Pepsi, the Taiwanese interests of which were firmly held by members of Soong's family. All of this provides a backdrop to the creation of the Georgetown Club in March 1966. Its main organizers included Gray, Park, and Chennault, along with Henry Person Pitts, Lawrence Murthan, and General Grace B. Erskine. The club was officially established for the purpose of bringing together leaders who had an impact on the United States and the world through their work in various business, professional, civic, social, and political milieus. Pitts and Murthan, according to the Washington Post, worked alongside Gray at H&K at the time of the club's founding. By the time the Koreagate hearings began in the late 1970s, Pitts had left H&K and gone to work for the U.S. Information Agency, the once covert body set up during the Eisenhower administration to direct public diplomacy and Cold War propaganda. Erskine had a lengthy career in the world of intelligence and covert operations. In 1950, he ran the military wing of the survey mission to Southeast Asia, which brought him into close contact with the anti-communist interests that were aligned with the domestic China lobby. Working closely with representatives of nationalist China, he developed a military strategy to support KMT fighters in Burma and their allies in Thailand. This was the birth of Operation Paper, which marshaled the resources of CIA operatives such as the mob-linked banker and OSS veteran Paul Helliwell. Arms flowed to Thailand and Burma aboard ships chartered by Sea Supply, a front company organized by Helliwell, while others were procured through the shadowy World Commerce Corporation. Peter Dale Scott has argued that Operation Paper was a key point in the development of U.S. intelligence complicity in the global drug trade. At the very least, it marked a major instance of intelligence indirect support for drug traffickers. In 1953, Erskine became the Director of Special Operations at the Department of Defense. This put him in charge of an obscure office within the Pentagon that served as a liaison between the armed forces and the CIA. Here, Erskine saw an ever-increasing number of covert operations and special wars dotting the globe. Operating under Erskine was the infamous Edward Lansdale, America's architect of guerrilla warfare and psychological operations in the post-war era. When Erskine suffered a heart attack in 1957 and took a protracted leave from the Special Operations Office, Lansdale stepped in and ran it in his stead. The intersection of the Georgetown Club's membership with China lobby interests and skilled operators in the world of covert intelligence was apparently unending. The manager of the club, for example, was Norman Larson. Larson had previously worked in the Washington offices of the Lifeline Foundation, one of the charitable bodies owned by Texas oilmen and financier of right-wing causes, H.L. Hunt. Other recipients of Hunt's largest included Foreign Intelligence Digest, a private intelligence magazine organized and edited by Douglas MacArthur's former intelligence chief, Charles Willoughby. Damn. While Willoughby operated far from the environs of the Georgetown Club, numerous authors have highlighted his linkages to the wider China lobby network. David Clayton, for example, writes that the lobby was intrinsically tied to advocates of a foreign policy of rollback, and to MacArthur through his intelligence chief, General Charles Willoughby. And Peter Dale Scott writes that others who used Joseph McCarthy to settle old scores included the Chinese nationalists of the China lobby, their spokesman, Alfred Kohlberg, and General MacArthur's Prussian-born intelligence chief in Japan, General Charles Willoughby. The expansive nature of this network can also be illustrated by Norman Larson's membership in the International Youth Federation for Freedom, a nonprofit anti-communist group that appears to have had some working relationship with the CIA. The International Youth Federation for Freedom was founded by none other than Tong Sun Park, along with his close friend and college roommate, Douglas Caddy. Park, in his Korea Gate testimony, makes a passing reference to Caddy, noting that Caddy, who would appear later in the course of the Watergate scandal by serving briefly as E. Howard Hunt's attorney, had been the executive director of the Young Americans for Freedom. As noted in the previous chapter, Young Americans for Freedom had been organized by former CIA officer, close friend of Roy Cohn, and National Review founder William F. Buckley, and counted Charles Willoughby on its advisory board. When Park mentioned Caddy in his testimony, it was during a line of questioning concerning a man who later figured heavily in the clandestine espionage activities of Robert Maxwell, Senator John Tower. John Tower, who was also a member of the Georgetown Club, had been particularly close to Park. "I was a friend of the Tower family," Park stated, before noting Tower's involvement in helping young Americans for freedom, which was founded by one of my closest friends. The closest friend alluded to here was Caddy. A State Department telegram concerning the Georgetown Club reports that for the first 6 years of its existence, the club had operated in the red. Nevertheless, it managed to stay afloat, apparently through the intercession of its owners. The governing board was divided equally between the Democratic and Republican parties. The telegram goes on to state that, at the time, Clark W. Thompson had been serving as chairman of the club's board. Thompson was the quintessential moderate Texas Democrat, having served for some 3 decades as one of the state's representatives. Working both sides was Thompson's forte. For instance, when it came to the issue of school desegregation, he broke with most of his colleagues who opposed it, while he also voted against the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960. This is prime example of, I'm left or no, it's all one big ass club. Big ass club. Back to scheduled programming. A careful examination of Thompson's affiliations reveals links to the worlds of organized crime and intelligence. Wow. Thompson was married to the daughter of William Lewis Moody Jr., a key player in the world of Texas finance and insurance. Moody's flagship firm was American National Insurance Company, ANICO, founded in Galveston, Texas in 1905. The Moody's were briefly mentioned in the last chapter as Moody's grandson, Sharon Moody Jr., was a close friend and client of Roy Cohn. According to a mutual friend of Cohn's and Moody's, the eccentric Moody supplied Cohn with many little boys of the nines, freaks, which he also did for other specific guests who visited his Texas ranch. Thompson had served on the board and as ANICO's treasurer during the 1920s, but departed when he entered politics. At the same time, he was serving as chairman of the Georgetown Club. He had rekindled ties to the conglomerate and was listed as its official lobbyist. Morris Schenker, best known as Jimmy Hoffa's attorney, was also ANICO's attorney for a time, and he helped bring the assurance firm into the mob-dominated world of Las Vegas hotels and casinos. As Sally Denton and Roger Morse write, ANICO funneled untold millions into Las Vegas gambling interests, including $13 million to Schenker himself, and most significantly, to Parvin Doorman, the company that owned the Stardust, Aladdin, and Fremont. It certainly helped that E. Perry Thomas, the man credited with establishing the Las Vegas Strip, was closely aligned with George Mariner and George Eccles the offspring of a prominent Mormon banking and construction family. E.g., Mariner served as President Roosevelt's Federal Reserve chief. Wow. George Eccles maintained a spot on the board of Aneco and nurtured ties to a number of ventures that were, at the very least, adjacent to organized crime. George Eccles was also affiliated with American Bankers Life Assurance Company, located in Miami, Florida, where the CIA's Paul Helliwell served as its general counsel. Furthermore, the offices of American Bankers Life were used by Helliwell as headquarters for the agency's sea supply operation. In addition to this important CIA linkage, American Bankers Life was also connected to Miami National Bank. As discussed in Chapter 1, Miami National was identified in 1969 as having served between 1963 and 1967 as a conduit through which hot syndicate money was exported by Meyer Lansky's couriers and laundered through the Interlocking Exchange and Investment Bank in Geneva. Clearly, the Georgetown Club was nestled within a wider network of entities and institutions that were very sensitive to Washington backroom politics, organized crime, and CIA. Perhaps this is why, as reported in numerous accounts, the CIA became concerned that one of the main figures behind the club was Tong Sung Park, a known asset of the Korean CIA. While the KCIA and the CIA were cooperating entities, the KCIA did engage in activities, such as those that later blossomed into the Koreagate scandal, that were seen as compromising U.S. political figures and also seen as potentially disruptive for U.S. geopolitical interests. As a result, the CIA dispatched an agent to monitor the club's comings and goings. That individual was Edwin P. Wilson, a man who would become known as a rogue agent roughly a decade later, after he was linked to various terrorist and assassination plots. A sizable portion of Wilson's early career in the CIA entailed operating undercover as a staffer for the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, AFL-CIO. The large union combined known as a proponent of business unionism. Since the agency's inception, the agency and the AFL-CIO had worked closely together, with the union providing cover for agents and operations, while the CIA often subsidized the activities of the AFL-CIO's foreign wings. Wilson worked in the office of Paul Hall, the head of the AFL-CIO's Maritime Trades Department, which covered unions involved in shipping-related trades and industries. This was the beginning of Wilson's long-running involvement in maritime activities. After leaving the AFL-CIO, his work for the CIA involved the management of proprietary firms, many of which operated in the world of shipping, freight forwarding, and logistics. One of the first of these was Maritime Consultants, which had been set up in Washington, D.C. with CIA funds. According to Joseph Trento, within months, he was chartering barges to Vietnam, arranging cover and commercial business for CIA agents, and setting up businesses around the world. Using his maritime cover, Wilson did detailed surveys of nearly every port in Africa and the Pacific. One wonders if Wilson's involvement with the Georgetown Club had less to do with monitoring the activities of Gray, Park, and Chenault, and more to do with managing the complexities of these covert maritime operations. It is certainly possible, given Gray's own past with the Navy. In addition, Wilson's business in Vietnam would have gained considerably from contacts with Anna Chenault, who was closely connected to the government and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. At any rate, the arrival of Wilson at the Georgetown Club marked the beginning of a long association between him and Gray. Hold up, just gonna take a nice little swig there, swig of water. There were, for example, their trips to Taiwan, where each had business interests that, in all likelihood, were interrelated. Wilson gained lucrative contracts from the nationalist Chinese military, while Gray signed on the Taiwanese government as a client. The account was entrusted to George Murphy, an actor who became a U.S. Senator representing California, but at the time was an H&K employee. Curiously, Gray routed the work through a separate company that he set up specifically for these purposes, called GM, presumably for Gray Murphy. Susan Trento writes that, according to Wilson, Gray set up GM to handle the Taiwanese account. Since Anna Chenault entrusted Murphy, Gray put the senator in charge of GM. Murphy, unsurprisingly, was a member of the Georgetown Club. Some of Wilson and Gray's joint activities dovetailed with those of the CIA. Gray was a board member of Consultants International, a firm that Wilson managed from offices adjacent to those of H&K on K Street in the capital. Gray later disavowed knowing Wilson and stated that he had been added to the board of Consultants International without Gray's knowledge. Gray's account is hard to believe, and many of those embedded in this network, including H&K employees and Wilson himself, have pushed back against Gray's interpretation of events. At any rate, Consultants International was not simply a consultancy firm. It was also an agency proprietary firm, set up as a successor to Wilson's earlier CIA company front, Maritime Consulting. There are plenty of hints and suggestions that Gray, Wilson, Park, and the Byzantine web of China lobby activists and intelligence operatives that circulated around the Georgetown Club were involved in more than just social networking and the creation of lobbying groups. Eavesdropping and blackmail seem to have been part of the club's covert mandate. You don't say. Future Reagan National Security Advisor Richard Allen, who would have known Gray through the involvement of each in the Heritage Foundation. There goes that foundation. Suggested when interviewed by Susan Trento that the club was bugged. Jim Hogan, in his classic Sweet Agenda, points to even darker possibilities. He writes that he was informed in a letter from Frank Turpo, Wilson's longtime partner, that Wilson had used the club to collect dirt on prominent Washington politicians and businessmen by using it as a place to arrange trysts for the politically powerful. He quotes from the letter, Historically, one of Wilson's agency jobs was to subvert members of both houses of Congress by any means necessary. Certain people could be easily coerced by living out their sexual fantasies in the flesh. A remembrance of these occasions was permanently recorded via selected cameras. I'm sure for historical purposes only. The technicians in charge of filming were TSD personnel. The unwitting pornos. Whoa, 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 whoa. The unwitting porno stars advanced in their political careers, some of whom may still be in office. You may now realize the total ineffectiveness of the watchdog committees assigned to oversee clandestine operations. Former Nebraska State Senator John DeCamp, in his work on the Franklin scandal, the subject of Chapter 10, alleges that Gray was the closest friend in Washington of Harold Anderson, the publisher of the Omaha World Herald, who was alleged to have played a role in that scandal, which dealt with a politically connected nationwide pedophile ring. DeCamp also notes that Anderson was one of the key Nebraskans who was closely tied to the man at the center of the Franklin scandal, Larry King, who was also actively aided by George H.W. Bush in rehabilitating his post-scandal image. DeCamp, who attempted to expose government efforts to sweep the scandal under the rug in the Franklin cover-up, also asserted that Gray himself was reportedly a specialist in homosexual blackmail operations for the CIA. DeCamp also wrote that the sexual blackmail operations in which Gray's associate, Edwin Wilson, was intimately involved were apparently continuing to the work of a reported collaboration of Gray from the 1950s. McCarthy Committee Counsel Roy Cohn. Cohn and Gray reportedly knew each other, but the exact nature of their relationship is difficult to discern. They were, however, most certainly intimately acquainted during Ronald Reagan's 1980s president, Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign, when both men worked closely with William Casey, who was the campaign's manager and subsequently Reagan's CIA director. Shortly after the campaign, Cohn, Gray, and Jeffrey Epstein would all take on arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi as a client at the dawn of the Iran-Contra affair. Wow. Hmm. I'm going to read a bit more. Definitely read a bit more. This is nuts. Definitely got to read a bit more. Whew. The next part. Ooh, the title of this next part of this chapter, The CIA's Blonde Ghost. Edwin Wilson ostensibly left the CIA in 1971 under incredibly murky circumstances, though the most common story involves his commercial cover being blown by a Soviet asset. Per the media narrative that was spun during the course of the manhunt for Wilson and his subsequent imprisonment, Wilson is said to have cut ties with the agency and become a covert private operator for hire. A rogue. Yet Evidence released not only during his trial but well after its conclusion shows that Wilson remained in close contact with a cadre of CIA officers and officials whose activities, as the 1970s wore on and the agency was bantered by reformist efforts, took on increasingly strange and frightening forms. This circle was centered around the man known as the Blonde Ghost, Theodore Ted Shackley. Shackley, like Wilson, came from a background somewhat different from the usual CIA leadership, which tended to cultivate its upper ranks from the posh world of white shoe law firms and high finance. He, he instead hailed from Florida and began his career in the Army. His recruitment into the CIA came after a stint in the Army Counterintelligence Corps. By 1953, he was working under William Harvey at the West Berlin CIA station. Here, Shackley operated at the very frontier of the Cold War. The West Berlin station's activities were carried out under the shadow of the Berlin Wall, and the city was a veritable melting pot of espionage intrigue. While working under Harvey, Shackley may have gotten a taste for the more exotic aspects of CIA work. After he returned to the States, Harvey managed the CIA assassination team, with many of its members having been mob hitmen recruited into agency service under the auspices of the ZR Rifle Program. What? Oh, man. Harvey's assassination activities were woven into Operation Mongoose, the joint CIA Army covert war against Castro's Cuba. The central hub of the CIA side of the anti-Castro operations was the Miami station, codenamed JM Wave. Tucked away in an unassuming building on the extended campus of the University of Miami. The station employed from 300 to 700 agents and 2,000 to as many as 6,000 Cubans. In 1962, right as the CIA's Cuban project was spiraling towards its violent apex, Shackley became JM Wave's station chief. Joseph Trento asserts that in this period, Shackley was mentored in the fine art of covert financial activities by Paul Helliwell. Helliwell shadowed Shackley. The importance of income from agency fronts. According to numerous case officers who worked at JM Wave, Helliwell helped Shackley make certain that fronts like Zenith Technical Enterprises were the perfect cover for JM Wave. These allegations are partially corroborated by other sources. The Washington Post, for instance, reported in 1980 that Helliwell was instrumental in helping to direct a network of CIA undercover operations and proprietaries. Curiously, one of the only declassified CIA documents to mention Helliwell is a list of files removed from internal circulation in order to avoid turning them over to Watergate investigators. Almost all the other files in the list deal directly with the CIA's support of anti-Castro Cuban exiles. Damn. JM Wave was where Shackley formed close relationships that would shape the rest of his long career, both inside the agency and out. Chief among Shackley's alliances that were forged via JM Wave was Thomas Clines, who later emerged as a key player in the Iran-Contra conspiracy. Clines served as Shackley's deputy, even after both men stepped beyond the confines of the CIA itself. There was also a score of Cuban exiles, the notorious Felix Rodriguez, known for his involvement in the death of Marxist revolutionary Che Guevara and his own role in Iran-Contra, Rafael Quintero, and Ricardo Chavez. Many of these individuals followed Shackley overseas in 1966, when the Blonde Ghost was made the CIA station head in Vientiane, Laos. It was a perfect spot for a crew that was increasingly adept at wet works, i.e., assassinations, and black operations. This particular station oversaw the agency's participation in the secret war being waged in Laos and Cambodia. Vientiane, during this period, was the epicenter of a major illicit trade in contraband, gold, and raw opium, most of it destined for Saigon. Laos boasted a handful of prominent opium merchants with deep ties to the country's political and military establishment. One of those merchants, Owan Ratikon, had previously commanded the Laotian army, and his drug trafficking operations saw extensive collaboration with Nguyen Cao Khai, the high-ranking commander of the South Vietnamese Air Force. God damn. Not only were Khai and his men moving raw opium from Laos on their planes, but Khai was also working closely with the CIA in their secret war efforts such as Operation Haylift, which dropped saboteurs deep into the jungles of North Vietnam. The raw opium was refined into heroin, then moved into Hong Kong, where it was ready for global export. I wonder where. This circuit was of immense interest to American organized crime figures. In 1965, Meyer Lansky's financial agent, John Pullman, flew to Hong Kong, reportedly to investigate the burgeoning wartime trade. Excuse me. Several years later, Florida mob boss Santo Traficante arrived in Hong Kong and soon made his way to Saigon. Soon after Traficante's visit to Hong Kong, writes Alfred McCoy, a Filipino courier ring started delivering Hong Kong heroin to mafia distributors in the United States. U.S. Bureau of Narcotics Intelligence reports in the early 1970s indicated that another courier ring was bringing Hong Kong heroin into the United States through the Caribbean, Traficante's territory. The presence of Traficante is telling. He had been an active supporter of the anti-Castro operations, and after the agency wound down its JM Wave activities, many Cuban exiles trained by the CIA as part of that program went to work trafficking drugs for Traficante. Talk about entanglement with supposedly legit and very illegitimate. Was Shackley involved in some way with Traficante's arrival in Southeast Asia? It is possible, as there are plenty of apocryphal stories about Shackley personally introducing Traficante to Vang Pao, a Laotian heroin warlord, during a 1968 trip to Saigon. While the details of those stories cannot be confirmed, Vang Pao would have had to have known of Shackley, as he commanded the Hmong troops that were being backed and trained by the CIA in Laos. According to McCoy, the CIA's logistical networks allowed Vang Pao to increase the efficacy of the Laos-South Vietnam opium trade. Air logistics for the opium trade were further improved in 1967 when the CIA and USAID gave Vang Pao financial assistance in forming his own private airline, Jane Huang Air Transport. The company's president, Lo Hamti, said the airline was formed in late 1967 when two C-47s were acquired from Air America and Continental Air Services. The company's schedule was limited to shuttle flights between Longtian and Vientiane that carried relief supplies and an occasional handful of passengers. Financial control was shared by Vang Pao, his brother, his cousin, and his father-in-law. Reliable Hmong sources reported that Zhanghong Air Transport was the airline used to carry opium and heroin between Longtian and Vientiane. This was the crucial context for the formation of a group that would later be known as Shackley's private CIA. On hand in Laos was Thomas Clines, and there they soon became acquainted with another future Iran-Contra co-conspirator, Richard Secord. An Air Force pilot, Secord had been detailed to the CIA's Laotian station, and he personally knew many of those involved in the traffic of opium via the airways, including the aforementioned Air Marshal Kai. Another figure who would also later play a key role in the Iran-Contra affair and who also worked with Shackley in Laos was Major John K. Singlaub. Singlaub had served alongside Paul Helliwell in the OSS. Playing an active role in logistical support for the agency's secret war was Edwin Wilson. Much of this involved a close working relationship with the head of the Southeast Asian Division in the CIA's Air America, James Cunningham, who also ultimately answered to Shackley. Good grief. Though Wilson was not stationed in Southeast Asia, he frequently made trips between Washington and Vientiane. There can be little doubt that these jaunts were of immense interest to Gray, Park, Chenault, and other members of the China lobby who populated Wilson's interstateside circle. The China lobby, after all, was wired into the world of intelligence and has stumped for the escalation of conflict in Southeast Asia, an escalation that finally erupted into the Vietnam War. Good grief. In 1968, Shackley took over the Saigon CIA station, which gave him operational oversight of a vast gamut of operations, including, for a period, the infamous Phoenix Program. The Phoenix Program, while financed by the CIA, operated under the auspices of CORDS, Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support. Overseeing CORDS was the CIA's old Southeast Asian hand and bureaucratic mastermind, William Colby. Rumors among the military's in-country brass abounded that Shackley exerted influence over Colby through sexual blackmail. Clearly, Shackley and Wilson, alleged to have been carrying out similar activities at the Georgetown Club, were quite similar in this regard. Colby, then married to his first wife, returned to Vietnam without his family from a stint back in Langley. According to retired U.S. Army Colonel Tullius Alcampura, who served in Vietnam, Colby had a girlfriend, a Vietnamese senator's wife. Shackley's colleagues soon realized that Shackley was keeping a book on the private lives of all his superiors in Vietnam, including Colby and military officers such as General Creighton Abrams, who, according to Akampora, was involved with a Vietnamese woman. God damn. If pressed upon by an undesirable topic by a colleague, Shackley would warn him off by mentioning any personal entanglements. As John Sherwood put it, he was good at letting you know he knew that he had something on you, that he had an edge. Shackley remained in Saigon until May 1972, when he took over as head of the CIA's Western Hemisphere Division. Since Cuba fell under the rubric of this division, it was something of a return for Shackley to his earlier haunts. Yet, by this point, the anti-Castro operations had largely fallen by the wayside. There was still operational support for Cuban exile groups, many of which were factionalizing into militant terrorist groups such as Coordination of United Revolutionary Organizations, CORU, C-O-R-U. The agency's eyes were darting further south, towards southern cone countries like Chile, where socialist leader Salvador Allende had come to power. From his perch at the top of the Western Hemisphere Division, Shackley was on the bureaucratic front line for the 1973 coup that brought Augusto Pinochet to power in Chile, and the parade of dirty wars that ripped across South America. Doesn't that sound familiar? I smell regime change for hegemony. Even before Shackley left Saigon, his network of contacts was busy making arrangements. Thomas Clines, who would soon be embroiled in the agency's ventures in Chile, had left Saigon in 1970 and rotated back stateside to spend time at the Naval War College. Joining him there was Richard Secord. Secord, in this period, completed his War College thesis, which had been directed by the CIA advisor to the president, Clarence Huntley. The prescient title of his thesis was Unconventional Warfare / Covert Operations as an Instrument of U.S. Foreign Policy. Throughout 1971, Clines kept in touch with Edwin Wilson, who was now allegedly operating outside of the CIA's purview. It was at that point that Clines brought Wilson into the realm of naval intelligence by way of a secretive unit known as Task Force 157. And good, my God. Keep on reading further. This is crazy. Task Force 157. The groundwork for what became Task Force 157, TF-157, was laid in 1965 by a memo drafted by President Johnson's Secretary of the Navy, Paul Nitze, titled Instructions for the Coordination and Control of the Navy's Clandestine Intelligence Collection Program. Nitze's Program for Naval Intelligence for Naval Human Intelligence, HMUNT. Nitze's Program for Naval Human Intelligence, HUMINT, gathering apparatus had originated with plans made by Admiral Rufus Taylor. Good grief. Taylor had served in the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, as well as the National Security Agency, NSA. In 1966, as this new Navy unit was being prepared for action, he took up a post as Deputy Director for the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. Later that same year, he became Deputy Director for the CIA, serving under Richard Helms. The first iteration of the Navy's HUMIT unit, established in 1966, was the Naval Field Operations Support Group. Author Michael McClintock suggests that the original template for the unit was Task Force 98, a Navy program that supported the Southeast Asian paramilitary activities carried out by Ed Lansdale and Lucien Conine. By July 1966, the support group was given the mandate to establish a worldwide intelligence collection organization while preserving non-intelligence attributability of collection operations. Internal Navy communiques and information sharing identified the support group by name. Soon, to help obscure the organization's activities, it was granted the code name Task Force 157. TS-157's primary focus was intelligence information on communist bloc naval and shipping information. Subunits were devised and located across the world. Many of these were located in ports, adjacent to shipping channels and choke points for maritime traffic, and even out at sea. Just as the CIA deployed commercial covers for their operations, TF-157 set up front companies to charter ships and maintain offices. Listening posts were established, and TF-157 worked closely with the military and the CIA in developing improved navigational maps for the support of military activities. TF-157 even maintained its own international communication system based on encryption technology inherited from the NSA, which was codenamed the Weather Channel. TF-157's operational autonomy was only partial. In answer to both the Office of Naval Intelligence and the CIA, though between the two, the agency apparently had an edge for nabbing the various projects that TF-157 developed. When it came to organizing the networks of proprietary companies, it was again to the CIA that TF-157 turned. Ed Wilson is the man you need, the CIA told the task force. Wilson, meanwhile, learned of TF-157 from Thomas Clines, presumably with Ted Shackley lurking not far in the background. Soon enough, Wilson was on the TF-157 payroll, making an annual salary of $32,000. Despite his official salary, Wilson quickly became a multi-millionaire. This was because TF-157 allowed him to keep earnings from the commercial fronts he set up, which he operated as legitimate businesses. Right. Two of the new front companies were World Marine Inc. and Maryland Maritime Company. They were registered in D.C. and were run from the same offices as Consultants International, the same company where Robert Keith Gray sat on the board of directors. There was also Around World Shipping and Charting, based in Houston, Texas, where Wilson spent a considerable amount of time. Whether Around World was tied to TF-157 like World Marine and Maryland Maritime, or a CIA-adjacent firm like Consultants International is unknown, but it later played a key role in the activities of Shackley's private CIA. As Wilson was settling into his new position, TF-157 was becoming embroiled in one of the major foreign policy shifts of the Cold War era. Nixon and Kissinger, as part of a broader geopolitical push for detente, a relaxing of tensions with the Soviet Union and China, alongside curbing the nuclear arms race, were pushing for an opening with China. The initiative was treated with the utmost secrecy. While Alexander Haig was involved in the efforts, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and CIA were largely boxed out. For Kissinger, the success of these China-focused efforts would require the diplomatic channels and corridors of information to be airtight. You don't say. Kissinger appealed to Admiral Thomas H. Maurer, then serving as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Maurer had previously been in chief of naval operations and thus had operational involvement with TF-157. Maurer arranged for Kissinger to use the Weather Channel to send encrypted messages and arranged the necessary diplomatic back channels for this impending geopolitical shift. What Kissinger did not seem to realize was that Maurer opposed Kissinger's bureaucratic wrangling in Nixon's overarching imperative of circumventing the usual bastions of political power. Maurer also strongly opposed the initiative itself and was allied with elements of the pro-KMT China lobby. Wow. 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 Here comes more. The Radford-Moore affair. Yeoman Charles Radford barely knew Jack Anderson, the famed multi-muckraking journalist. He was actually more familiar with Anderson's parents, whom he had met during a posting in India in 1970. Radford had been raised Mormon, a faith he shared with the Andersons, and this seems to have kindled a casual relationship between the young naval officer and the older couple. In 1970, Radford briefly crossed paths with Jack Anderson himself, having been invited by his parents to a family reunion. It seemed innocuous enough. The second time Radford met Anderson was over a year later, in December 1971. Anderson, out of the blue, had contacted Radford and invited him to dinner at the Empress, a Chinese restaurant in which he owned a stake. Radford later told Jim Hogan that the reason he took Anderson up on his offer was because he was Jack Anderson. He was famous. The dinner took place on a Sunday evening. The following day, Anderson ran in his newspaper column, renowned for the journalist's intrepid pursuit of insider sources in the fast-paced world of DC, an article that contained explosive revelations. Anderson's column brushed right up against the most sensitive undertaking then being carried out by President Nixon, Harry Kissinger's secret diplomatic negotiations with China. One primary channel being used by Kissinger was Pakistan, which had historically maintained close geopolitical relations with China. Pakistan's President Yahya Khan was especially close to Beijing and had garnered extensive military aid from China in the face of Pakistan's rising hostilities with India. China likewise had reason to oppose India. Tensions with the Soviet Union had been escalated steadily since the Sino-Soviet split, and Moscow had thrown its weight behind India. The chessboard was full, and Nixon and Kissinger were stepping carefully into a complex and potentially dangerous position. Pakistan's conflict with India greatly complicated matters for the administration. Outwardly, it took a position of neutrality. In 1971, when martial law was imposed in East Pakistan by President Khan, the White House made an announcement. The United States does not support or condone this military action. Behind closed door, however, it was a very different story. Nixon and Kissinger had embarked on a covert path of tilting toward Pakistan. President Khan was assured that the administration would not do anything to complicate the situation or embarrass him. What was unfolding was a truly remarkable series of events. Nixon's rise to the Oval Office had been dependent on the support of the domestic China lobby, and he personally maintained close relations with the KMT's top leadership. The Kissinger-led initiative toward China undermined all of that. In the course of his ongoing negotiations with China, Kissinger was tacitly abandoning the hawkish iterations of a pro-Taiwanese foreign policy. The administration, he said, wasn't looking for a two-China solution or a one China, one Taiwan solution. There was also talk of committing the U.S. military to an exit strategy from Vietnam and a reduction of the U.S. troop presence in the Middle East. The diplomatic channels of these negotiations were fragile, complex, and most of all, secret. Nixon and Kissinger strove to keep the agenda hidden. The CIA, the State Department, the Joint Chiefs, the China lobby itself, and even Soviet interests were recognized as threats to the long-term plan. But Anderson, in his column, nearly scuttled it all. In a single article, he revealed that despite the carefully calculated public position of the neutrality, the tilt toward Pakistan was well underway. It threatened to reveal the diplomatic back channel while also putting a question into people's minds. Why exactly was the U.S. tilting towards Pakistan? Journalist Clark Molenhoff, who served as a special counsel to Nixon in 1969, summed up the implications of Anderson's reporting in a column published on January 22, 1972. Kissinger's role in the India-Pakistan policy seems to be faulty, he wrote, before adding that there is a question of why the administration was secretly advocating for a tilt for Pakistan when India was able to prove far quicker its overwhelming military superiority. Molenhoff then sketched out what he saw as the bigger picture, implicating Nixon and Kissinger's drive towards extreme bureaucratic compartmentalization. At both the State and Defense Department, there is hope that President Nixon will view these errors as evidence that soon changes are indeed in the National Security Council's methods of operations. Both departments point out that this isn't the first time the National Security Council decisions haven't been supported by a realistic appraisal of the facts. Within the corridors of power, Anderson's revelations of the tilt strategy set off a firestorm. It was quickly determined that the journalists must have had access to at least 3 memos that were highly secret and had only been issued to a handful of people. Those people were Kissinger himself, Alexander Haig, Admiral Robert O. Welander, the military assistant for national security affairs to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Moore, and Welander's assistant, Yeoman Charles Radford. Welander eliminated himself from suspicion for the leak, as well as Kissinger and Haig. The culprit had to have been Radford, yet what What happened next only increased the strangeness of the case. Radford, who had acted as a document courier and aide to members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Council, was subjected to a polygraph test by Pentagon interrogation specialist. When it came to questions concerning the theft of confidential memoranda from diplomatic pouches and burn bags, the yeoman became agitated. The cause of his concern was a very sensitive operation, writes Colony, which Radford could not discuss without the direct approval of Admiral Welander. Welander had initially kicked off the investigation into Radford. With allegations of a secret operation surfacing, however, he quickly moved to try to squash the investigation before it went any further. The attempt did not succeed, and Radford ended up revealing his role in the military-led espionage ring. The yeoman had pilfered confidential files and made copies of uncounted documents, just thousands of documents. He made notes on reports of Kissinger's meeting with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai and other sensitive documents related to the China Initiative. These were then turned over to people working for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who used them to learn the inner workings of the Nixon-Kissinger strategy, bypassing the carefully constructed blockages on the flow of information within the top tiers of the U.S. government. Radford would turn the documents over to Admiral Welander, who, in turn, gave them to Admiral Moorer. According to Radford, his contribution put Admiral Moorer in a very powerful position to anticipate what Kissinger was going to do and say in National Security Council meetings. Welander later hinted that Alexander Haig was involved in the ring as well. There was little doubt, he suggested, that Haig had known of Radford's meddling with the diplomatic pouches, and Haig himself had, at times, assigned Radford to accompany Kissinger on diplomatic trips. According to Radford, the whole operation was designed to thwart a wide-ranging conspiracy that was taking root at the highest levels of the foreign policy establishment. At the center of this conspiracy was Kissinger himself, here appearing as an alleged agent of the Rockefeller family, and the institution where the Rockefellers carried so much weight, the Council on Foreign Relations. The purpose of this alleged conspiracy, writes Jim Hogan, was to win the Soviets' cooperation in guaranteeing the Rockefellers' continued domination over the world's currencies, in exchange for which, Radford insists, Kissinger was to construct a foreign policy that would ensure eventual Soviet hegemony and a one-world government. But the source of his knowledge about this conspiracy, Radford said, was Welander and Moorer. The accusations being made by Radford echo those being made by the John Birch Society and other groups and actors operating in the same milieu, many of which were also intimately connected to the KMT China lobby. The aforementioned Charles Willoughby, for example, made this world his primary haunt. Many of the accusations made by John Birch Society affiliates that Kissinger himself was a Soviet mole appeared later in the 1970s, with Frank Kappel's Henry Kissinger, Soviet agent, and Gary Allen's Kissinger, the secret side of the Secretary of State. Wow. Kappel, in the 1960s, had worked for Willoughby's Foreign Intelligence Digest. What makes this important is that Moorer himself had maintained extensive ties to the John Birch Society and related groups. These ideas are intensified in the later part of the 1970s and the 1980s when he became affiliated with the American Security Council, the preferred outpost of military hawks who laid the intellectual groundwork for the so-called Reagan Revolution. Right. There are two puzzling loose threads that are evident when considering the Radford-Moore affair. The first is that, due to Kissinger's use of the TF-157 weather channel, Moore and the Joint Chiefs were already privy to much of the information concerning the China Initiative. Likewise, though Edwin Wilson's arrival at TF-157, there is a distinct possibility that the CIA was also listening in, and perhaps as well, Wilson's KMT China lobby friends. It is through the China lobby and the incestuous networks of defense hawks, military operatives, and Washington fixers that these two sides met. Was this the original source of Moore and Wielander's manipulation of Radford? The second loose thread is that Radford, while admitting to pilfering thousands of pages of sensitive documentation, fervently denied having leaked the documents to Jack Anderson. He disavowed a close association with the journalist, noting they had only met a handful of times and were distant acquaintances at best. If it is true that Radford had not leaked the documents, who did and for what ends? A likely answer is that Wielander or Moore or somebody working on behalf of them was responsible for the leak. With the information gained from both the access to the T-157 channels and through Radford's pilfering, they had an inside look at the tilt strategy and its position within a wide range of geopolitical calculus that threatened to shift the entire thrust of the Cold War. Perhaps by hanging their asset Radford out to dry, they had hoped to derail Kissinger's process through a calculated leak to Anderson. But what about Anderson himself? His appearance with Radford at the Empress would then suggest that he was at least partially complicit in this plot. Surprisingly, Anderson boasted long-standing ties to the China lobby. He seemed particularly close to Anna Chennault. The two had been co-founders of the Chinese Refugee Relief Organization, a pro-KMT humanitarian agency that maintained offices at 1612 K Street. This office was just down the street from Robert Keith Gray's H&K offices and the offices of John Wilson's TF-157 fronts. When the organization was operational, Chennault played the role of president and Anderson served as its secretary. There is also the fact that a column of Anderson's had been used to hint at John F. Kennedy's connection to the Stephen Ward-connected sex ring that sparked the Profumo affair. Wow. As mentioned in the last chapter, Anderson had co-written in the column, Britishers who read American criticisms of Profumo throw back the question, what high American official was involved with Marilyn Monroe? Which was apparently part of a Hoover-connected effort to use sex blackmail obtained from the broader networks woven throughout the Profumo affair against Kennedy. This suggests that Anderson's column had, on certain occasions, been weaponized by powerful political factions well before this particular column in the early 1970s. It is also worth noting that in the post-Watergate era, Anderson held accounts at and stock in Diplomat National Bank in D.C., where Anna Chennault sat on the board of directors. The bank was used as a conduit for the Korean CIA and the closely united Unification Church, which, like Anderson, held bank stock. Never one to be far from the action, Tongson Park told American friends that he was behind the bank and that bank chairman Charles Kim was his agent. This wasn't the only suspect bank that Anderson was connected to. During the 1960s, he owned complimentary shares of the District of Columbia National Bank, which had been organized by the Democratic Party fixer Bobby Baker and Ed Levinson, a notorious organized crime insider. Joining Anderson at this bank was Arthur Arundel. Arundel, who had served under Edwin Lansdale in Southeast Asia, was the son of Pepsi lobbyist Russell Arundel. As mentioned earlier, Pepsi itself was closely tied to the China lobby and to the KMT itself. Even the restaurant used to implicate Radford can be found within this matrix. Anderson, as mentioned, had a stake in the establishment, yet so did Anna Chenault. These connections between Anderson and the China lobby, curiously enough, are known thanks to a dossier on the journals compiled by the White House plumbers. Soon enough, the plumbers would be making history, and Anderson would be there too. There is every indication that he, like so many others in this bizarre world, had foreknowledge of the events that were about to take place, which would later be remembered simply as, wait for it, Watergate. I'm going to cap it right there because, as I said before, this is this is like a 75-page chapter. And I'm like halfway into this because for the next part on Monday, which would be to be resuming a part 2 of my reading, will be Black Bags and Inside Jobs. That also sounds very apropos. With that, hopefully you enjoyed the reading. A lot of heavy information here. And with that, enjoy the rest of your day. Stay cool, like I always say. And continue to get more informed. Have a good rest of your day. Paul Greene-Dennis out.